He entered that cafe like any other patron, torn clothes, reserved eyes, and a weary smile not quite reaching his lips. Nobody had any idea who he was. To them, he was another poor dude seeking heat and a coffee. But upon the waitress, a young black woman accustomed to serving respect she never got, uttering 3 little words, the world screeched to a halt, the faces turned, the silence descended, and in that moment, the reality of power, prejudice, and humanity untangled. Because sometimes, the ones we take for granted are the ones who own it all. Marcus had always been a believer in hard work, the kind that never made the headlines but paid the bills and kept hope alive. Each morning before sunup, he'd pull on his worn shoes and walk to the tiny downtown café, a café where coffee was robust but respect was scant. As one of a handful of black workers, he'd learned to smile over whispers, to pour for those who passed by him, looking blind. Yet, he never gave in to bitterness. He dreamed larger than the narrow walls of the café. Downtown, there was another man with a life Marcus couldn't even dream. Ethan Rhodes, rich, admired, the sort of man whose name flung open doors. Yet wealth had never filled the void in his heart. So he got up one morning and decided to do something that no one could have ever anticipated. Go into his own café, dressed as a stranger. He wanted to observe how people really treated the people whom they believed had nothing. Something neither Marcus nor Ethan realized was that this peaceful morning would destroy illusions about race, power, and what it really means to look at another human being. Because sometimes the character test doesn't arrive in boardrooms or meetings. It arrives in moments no one's supposed to witness. As Ethan entered the cafe that day, no one saw him. Gone was the suit, substituted with faded jeans and a worn jacket and dog-tired eyes that spoke a tale few wished to hear. Roasted beans filled the air with their sweet scent, but underlying it hung something bitterer, judgment. He crept quietly into the back and sat down at a table, trying to become part of the scenery, or at least so he believed. Behind the counter, Marcus was cleaning tables, his smile firm but weary. He saw Ethan, a guy who seemed as though life had not been good to him, and nodded slightly. The kind of nod that speaks volumes in saying, "I see you." It was plain, human, authentic. But that's when Ethan started noticing the rest. The boss, a middle-aged man with a starched shirt and sharper voice, leaned in to one of the baristas and whispered. Glances were directed. Snickers ensued. A customer groused about the stranger sitting by the window. Another grumbled, "Watch him." And with each remark, Ethan's gut knotted. Nobody had any idea he owned this establishment. Nobody had any idea the man they were gawking at constructed the very walls their feet rested upon. He observed as Marcus made his way to the counter, poised to deal with a spate of orders. The manager intervened, interrupting him in mid-sentence. "You deal with the back today," he told him, his tone low but thick with intimidation. Marcus paused, perplexed. He'd been on front service for weeks. The explanation was obvious. There was a VIP customer at table 3, a person who, it seemed, had to be waited on by the right sort of face. Ethan's heart dropped. The injustice wasn't loud, it was silent, polite, wrapped in professionalism. That made it worse. Marcus vanished through the doors of the kitchen, shoulders pulled in, pride swallowed. And Ethan, standing in his corner, felt something tilt. The disguise wasn't an experiment anymore. It was exposure. He waited. It was 15 minutes later when Marcus came back, bearing a tray, his face serene but eyes troubled. A coffee for Ethan was on it. They met at the counter. "For you, sir," Marcus said quietly, setting it down. There was respect in his voice, even for a man he believed had nothing. But before Ethan could reply, the manager appeared again. "Make sure he pays first," he said. "We've had people like that walk out before." People like that. The words hung in the air. Marcus stood still, the silence of the room closing in on him. Ethan received a shiver running down his spine. For the first time, he saw his own staff through the eyes of the judged. The room was alive with laughter, words, and quiet cruelty behind the facade of normalcy. Marcus dropped his eyes, silently ringing the order. Ethan's hands clenched around the cup, pounding hard. All of the faces around him became one question he couldn't stop asking himself. How many times had this occurred, right under his nose? The cafe had grown noisier, more crowded, though somehow chillier. Marcus slid through the din like a spirit, ignoring the jokes, the whispers, the manager's varying tones based on whom he was speaking to. Ethan observed it all, his disguise now weighing more than the clothes he'd donned. Every laugh cut deeper, every gaze burned hotter. Then it did. One cup fell from Marcus's tray, breaking all over the floor. The room fell silent. The manager's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "Unbelievable!" he boomed, so that everyone could hear. "You people can't even get simple things done. You people." The words hung in the air, biting and calculated. Marcus stiffened, jaw clenching as the patrons looked on, some smiling, some not looking. He crouched to wipe away the spill, but his hands shook. The shame was familiar, but today someone else knew it too. Ethan stood upright. The chair scraped along the floor, the noise cutting through the tension. Everyone's eyes were on him, the stranger they considered poor standing up for a worker they underappreciated. "That's enough," he whispered. The manager laughed, condescending. "Sit down, sir. We don't need advice from—" But the sentence was never completed. Ethan stepped into his jacket and set his access card on the counter, the one with gold lettering on it reading his full name and title. The manager's face went white. The murmurs ceased. "This is my café," Ethan said, his voice firm, his gaze focused on the man. "And I've learned more about what goes on here in one morning than I ever did behind my desk." The ensuing silence was stifling. Marcus stood there transfixed, disbelief and relief clashing in his chest. Ethan's following words hung in the air. "If this is how you treat the people who keep this place alive, maybe I've been blind all along." The room remained static. No noise, no confrontation, just truth, bare for all to witness. And as Ethan turned to Marcus, one thing crossed his mind. Sometimes it's losing your face that helps you see what's been standing in front of you all along. The following morning, the cafe was not the same. The walls that had rang with laughter and conversation now bore a heavy silence. The manager was gone, dismissed before dawn. But the transformation that counted most could not be signed in ink or documented in policy. It existed in the silence that ensued, and in the eyes of the individuals who had seen what true truth looked like. Ethan spent the following days sitting in the same corner, this time without the guys. He observed Marcus work, unflappable, dignified, going about as he had always done. No anger, no bitterness, just strength, the kind that is born out of enduring what others will never know. For Ethan, the disguise had begun as an experiment, but it evolved into something else, a mirror. He didn't just see his staff, he saw himself naked. The privilege of ease, the blindness of wealth, the complicity of silence. It all looked back at him. And he understood that racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in nice language, hides behind company policy, or smiles while it excludes. Marcus wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for change. And so Ethan set about where he was able, raising voices that had been silenced, advocating for those that had been ignored, and making that cafe a destination where value wasn't determined by color, but by character. Even so, one fact nagged him. For each Marcus who's visible, there are thousands more that aren't. Because injustice doesn't stop when one man wakes up. It ends when enough of us refuse to look away. So the question isn't whether Ethan learned his lesson. The real question is, When will we?